So all this other stuff's going to be cut. When I go here, this is the show. Nothing else can happen other than this. So we're ready? Greetings to all the viewers. This is Dr. Obitashaka, the Dr. Obitashaka Show. Once again, we're privileged to have the distinguished warrior scholar, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, as our guest. How you doing, Dr. J?
Well, every day above ground is a good day when you have the age that I bring to the table. So I'm glad to be here, and certainly glad to be involved with you in trying to expose so much of this history. I really want to congratulate you on doing an unbelievable, excellent job. And so don't let that go to your head. And Queen Nzinga, who used to head our organization, ASCAC, she said, Rosin, I may not have it right, but she said, good work means you need to have more good work. So the good work that you're doing now needs to continue. What was it? More good work. Yes.
And I remember Sister Nzinga. Yeah, so today, what we wanted to do was go into deeper dimensions of what we discussed, you and I, 2 weeks ago. And the topic for today is two of Africa's greatest leaders, President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. And we're looking at them to glean out and draw out lessons for building Pan Africanism today in Africa and around the world. And we're taking these two because these were giants in terms of Africa's independence movement and their accomplishment and their organization and their legacy. Before going into this, I just want to remind the viewers that if you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribers button. And we're going to give instructions for people that don't know what to do when they hit the subscribers button. So today, we'll get some historical examples also. As we look at these great leaders, we'll also be looking at some problems that they had to face in terms of the mentalities of some of the people they worked with. We're talking about African people. And this is referring to mental slavery and mental colonialism that still exists, and what I call since '68, the choice between two cultures. So the webinar that we're planning, that will be a year webinar called The Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom. When we conclude this discussion, we'll be talking about why this is so important to any project for freeing African people, freeing African minds. So people who are interested should contact me at otashaka@sbcglobal.net and voice your interest, because we have to have a certain number of people before we can start this webinar. So this is a real pleasure. You're getting with Dr. J a wealth of historical information, a lot of which is not in books. And so it's very important that we note that, and we understand just how important this exchange really is. In the last discussion that we had, you, Dr. Jake, had noted some things that I didn't know, and I'm sure most of our viewers didn't know. One was, while I've apprenticed under Dr. John Henry Clark, as you did, I didn't realize the scope of his activities in terms of developing a younger generation of scholars and organizers. I knew he was an advisor to Malcolm. You know, I knew his role in ASCAP, but you brought out a lot more. You brought out how Dr. Clark introduced you and other scholars and activists to people like Dr. Mokhtar, who's very important in the United Nations. And he had him at his home with you all sitting there and getting that kind of acquaintanceship and introduction and relationship. He, in your last discussion, you talked about how Professor Clark gave you the assignment, and that's a relationship in and of itself, to translate Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop's Civilization or Barbarism from French into English, which you did. You talked about, and a lot of people didn't know that. You know, they didn't know you translated that. And a lot of them don't know that you write and speak French. Then you talked about y'all going to the hills in Puerto Rico to plot out some strategy around education strategy. And this has got a lot to do with the background of Black studies that a lot of people in Black studies don't know. And then the icing on the cake. And by the way, people behind me can see a poster, and one of them is a picture of Haile Selassie you can see him, and below him is Kwame Nkrumah. And so you related how there was a meeting with you, Professor Clark, and others with the Emperor Haile Selassie, head of Ethiopia, Emperor of Ethiopia. Last week, we discussed Pan Africanism. Ethiopianism is the mother of it, and this is like the mothership. You know what I mean? So this wasn't just little tidbits, and there are a lot more that I have discussed. Real history here. You hear me? Real history. And so I use that as a backdrop to have you get into a little discussion of your relationship to Professor Clark and this whole relationship just described. How did that help you in your own development as a person, as a scholar, as a warrior? What were some of the things that you were able to draw out of that relationship? Because John was really reproducing his own education, which had been exclusively outside of 1st to 12th grade apprenticeship. He didn't go to university. And he said this was the best education he got, as I pointed out the last time, because he didn't have to unlearn stuff, and he was learning at the feet of masters. So what did you gain from that, and where did you see others that he was bringing along gaining from that?
Well, fortunately, we've had these great mentors like Dr. Clark as a part of our work. And one of the beautiful things about him, which people usually don't deal with, he had a special love for Black women, for the mother principle. And he said to us early on, I am the product of 3 geniuses, 3 special persons. And he named them. He said his grandmother, who used to ride him around in her wagon when she was washing clothes, his mother, and his 5th grade school teacher, Eveline Taylor. In other words, he could see, as he went through life, the push from this mother principle taking care of his path. And eventually he was able to make his way to New York. And then he saw the male giants that complemented this female foundation that he had. And the male giants included, of all people like Arthur Schomburg. And most people don't, well, who's Schomburg? They know about the Schomburg Center and institution, but Arthur Schomburg was one of those individuals who shared, who brought the people in close to him and gave them lessons. He loved to have a crowd of young people in the Schomburg Center. It wasn't a hideaway for him. It wasn't some place where you went to do your writing and not be bothered with it. It was a place to galvanize the young people. So that impacted on Dr. Clark. And then, of course, the person who was also in Harlem at that time was Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen. And so they eventually, Dr. Ben found his home in his apartment at Lenox Terrace. That's at 135th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard. And then you had Dr. Clark. He lived 2 blocks away. So even in their physical placement in the heart of Harlem, they were right in the heart of Harlem, and the beat goes on. In other words, that special beat that was in the heart of Harlem goes on. Now, across from Dr. Ben's apartment complex was Harlem Hospital. Well, my wife was born in Harlem Hospital. So there's a special relationship in terms of Harlem Hospital. And then the Garvey movement and other organizations had their buildings in and around this community that nurtured. And what Dr. Clark appreciated was the process of the bookstore in the heart of Harlem was the centerpiece of searching for this knowledge. And that's where people met and discussed, people met and shared, people met and came up with their plans for how to raise this enormous African history and African-American history, African Caribbean history. So that when we went to Dr. Clark's house, because there wasn't enough chairs, we had to sit on the floor, we get pillows. So we were really sitting at the feet of the masters. He would bring in people to interrelate to and have a dialogue, but he wanted us there. He knew he was putting his hands and heart and consciousness in our shoulders. So the tiger cubs of my generation, in terms of just being in a 2 or 3 year closeness, you had Dr. James Turner, who set up the Black Studies Department at Cornell.
Really good man.
And a special person. And he took over the military takeover that had provided action for the students. In other words, the students were facing racial opposition, and they said, we need to arm ourselves because we can't trust these white folks. So they armed themselves, took over the center where the Black Studies was being developed. And it's a great lift to see them finally giving up the takeover after it had been worked out that the college would do all they could to develop an African center, of world-class African center. And so to see those fellows come out with the bulletproof vests, with their heavy weaponry, I mean, you just leap for joy. And that's
and then Turner has John Henry Clark and Doc Ben coming out and teaching at his university. And John gives 2 lectures that are really important, My Life in Search of Africa, which is put in book form, that
Yes.
really shows this whole process of how he developed. Yeah.
And the beautiful thing was, because he had this special relationship with Dr. Ben, they also shared where they fitted in. Now with Dr. Ben, he didn't want to hear about anything but Egypt, maybe a little about Ethiopia,
Right.
but he was not prepared. People said, well, what did he do with this? You know, Dr. Ben was, he gave us the gift that keeps on giving, the Nile Valley. And, but Dr. Clark had a wider range. And so that was good that they complemented each other. But James Turner first had Dr. Clark come up to teach a class at the Africana Center in Cornell. But everybody wanted Dr. Clark. I had him come and teach a course at the City College. We're the same system, but I said, we need to have him, who has opened the door, have his personal presence at the City College. And then people wanted him to travel everywhere to spark this flame of African consciousness. And Dr. Clark, a little diminutive guy, I said, you don't have to worry about coming back to us, to City, because you've got too much in putting the program at Hunter together. So he gave us permission to use his courses. So he had these courses that were books in and of themselves. He was so in detail. And so what I did was I took 2 of his courses and took his name off, whited it out, and put Dr. Jeffries in there. So I taught off of his course syllabus. That's what he wanted us to do. And then knowing that going up to Cornell was a real problem because you had to fly up there, and you didn't fly on decent planes. You flew on these little paper planes that the wind could blow up and down. And I dreaded going up there because I said, wait a minute. People said, don't worry about it. You're in the plane now. You're going to fly up to Ithaca. But be careful. You have to sit here because the person in front of you, he's balancing the plane there. And in other words, they had to balance the damn plane. And you go up and down in this thing. So I said, wait a minute. And so Dr. Clark, he said, I'll replace my teaching at Cornell with Dr. Ben. Now, Dr. Ben needed a home because he had gone into many, many places and had raised so much hell that sometimes he couldn't last, not a semester, he didn't last a good few weeks before the people said no.
Sometimes not a day.
That's right. He would go and raise hell. And so what the beautiful thing was Dr. Clark said, you go up to Cornell. And Turner's thing was so powerful and nourishing that Dr. Ben taught there for 15 years.
Wow.
At no other place could he have been there that long because he would be getting into too many conflicts and too many difficulties and raising too much hell. And so Turner had the brilliance of an administrator of taking care of him. But unfortunately, Doc had his own little, what he wanted to do, and he was writing books and rewriting books and this and that. So Turner had said, look, Doc, you're a permanent part of our staff. But in order for you to get the full-time credit, you need to take another class so that if you take 3 classes, then you're full-time. Then you have pension and you have everything. No, I got to write my books. I got to go back down to Harlem. So that he taught there for 16 years, was the centerpiece of the work there, but he had no pension or anything.
Yeah,
And,
now that's important. What I want to do is just put this in the package, and it is that what you're describing here is John's development as well as how John helped develop others, and then how others contributed to the development and support of John and others like him. So in the case of the example you gave of the grandmother talked a lot about her husband, who was a fearless enslaved African. And this was John's first introduction to Africa. So his grandmother is the one that puts him on the path of Africa. And, you know, when you talk about the teacher that inspired him most, I should know, John noted that the school he went to, because it was a color thing going, it was a Black school, they had the light brigade and the dark brigade. And John was in the dark brigade. He said he was so glad he was in the dark brigade because he got the teacher who inspired him most. He had 2, but this one in particular, John said that he had begun to cave into the peer group and act dumb. And so she called him in at lunch. She didn't embarrass him before all the students. She put her hand on his chin so that he'd look at her. And she said, listen, young man, in life, if you have to go it alone, as long as you're right, do that. And then she said, I expect great things from you. And John said that inspired him throughout his life. That's why he talked about these 3 women, because he was trying to live up to their expectations. And then there was a woman who was a lady of the night, not one of those that he listed to you, but I know you know of her, Miss Chicken Leg.
Yes.
And she was one that would go to the school when John needed someone to represent him because his family was in the country picking cotton. So, and John was living in the city, the only family member that could be sent to go to school. And so all these ladies of the night put together money so that John got him a big encyclopedia. He was the only one that had one. And when he's leaving town to go see Arthur Schomburg, she sticks her head out the window. And you know, this is a compliment. This word is banned from this show, but she said, this little N is gonna make something great of himself one of these days. And John said, I didn't know about that because I really appreciated that, but I didn't know if I could live up to her expectations. And then when John gets to Harlem, he goes to what becomes later the Schomburg collection, where at the top floor, Arthur Schomburg is managing his collection, asked for a letter of introduction from the lady at the Schomburg collection to Arthur Schomburg. She said, just go up those stairs. And it's kind of like he's being told to go to heaven and he doesn't have the proper introduction. And when he comes in to see Arthur Schomburg, then he's saying he wants to know everything about African history right now. And that was the beginning of his apprenticeship. So you sitting at the feet of John, and it was a mouth to ear situation, that was the apprenticeship that John had undergone. And, you know, when he talked about Schomburg, Wallace Huggins, and others, he was talking about sitting at the feet of masters, but he was always talking first about how great their character was, and then about their knowledge. And so it's important for people watching this to get this. This apprenticeship thing that Dr. Theophil Obenga talked about, that he didn't see as apprenticeship, but was under Sheikh Anta Diop, this is what really shapes people. Formal education is one thing, but remember what Obenga said. He said his mind had been shut under French education, but when he apprenticed under Sheikh Anta Diop, his mind was open, and he said, I found myself. So when Dr. Jeffries was talking about the assignments he got, the courses that he shared, which again, something I didn't know, and then how Dr. Clark was building up the Black Studies program and Puerto Rican Studies program at Hunter, you know, and then all the other places he was, you know, you're showing how he was sharing and was developing people like he had been developed. And so this process is very important. Now, this discussion today is centered on President Kwame Nkrumah and President Julius Nyerere, and also the relationships that they had to various people. You stress this relationship, so I think it's important that we stress it. So could you talk about Nkrumah's background in Ghana, his ethnic group, where he came from, what kind of education he had in Ghana, people that may have inspired him, yes, and what led him to come to the United States?
I'll definitely move in that direction, but I would like to just add a little bit to what you mentioned in reference to Dr. Clark. And he came to New York, not on the Greyhound, and certainly not in a car and right, a train. He came hitchhiking.
He hoboed. He hoboed on a railroad train. Yeah.
He got up in the 30s. He got into Harlem and then got himself situated. But most people don't realize there's a period of several years where he was in the military. Yeah, and right, he was the caddy for Eisenhower and things like that. So he had a chance of seeing the big city, of seeing important people, and he could read their vulnerability as well as see their strengths. And then he wanted to have a team. So the Harlem History Club became not just a history club, that was his team and getting it together. So he had John Jackson there, an elder who was a self-taught scholar who claimed no university, but he was heavy into all the European deep philosophical thoughts, et cetera, et cetera. And so John Jackson was a part of the History Club with Huggins and the others. And so they had a group of support that became so very important to appreciate. A person who's left out, but he's very important. A pillar of Dr. Clarke's foundation were the Lamel brothers. Tilden Lamel moved from Denver, where he was an educator, and came into New York and became the head of the Hunter program. And Tilden Lamel made sure that he got Dr. Clarke situated. And so he was able to get his status raised up because Tilden was able to bring him, they gave him an honorary degree. They did a whole lot. The Lamel brothers, one of them was stationed in East Africa. Reason why I raise it is because I had a chance to go to Madagascar because the USIS Marilyn McCool.
Which is where my people are from, coming
Okay.
in the 17th century, you know.
Yes.
On
Well,
both sides of my family, they're from Madagascar. You know.
and so I had a chance to go up to Madagascar, and of course that's another world altogether. I mean, just going through the mountains and whatnot, and getting to the capital and whatnot. But there was a struggle between the French influence and the American influence in Madagascar, and so the American ambassador, he's not considered, even if he's been there longer in terms of the ambassadorship. The French are given superiority if they just got there a day after. So it was a rigged system in terms of status. But the beautiful thing was that the French ambassador was an arrogant son of a so-and-so. So the US ambassador said, I have this Jeffries, he speaks French, he understands this. I'm gonna put him next to that French ambassador. And of course, what happened was he was talking so much junk, and by the time I beat him down at the banquet, that's what the ambassador wanted, but it became even a bigger thing because the people from Madagascar were boycotting the process. But then when the word went out that there is an African from America who is talking more mess than you can imagine. And so the people started coming, and finally the big military man came, and he was just glad to be a part of the mix. I was just glad to see the different extension. But when I had to leave after a very successful stay, I flew to Kenya and to Nairobi. And who was there to greet me? Tilden Lamel's brother was the ambassador, and he sent the ambassador's car to meet me. Now, of course, the flag was covered, and but to have that type of status coming from these different family groups, so the Lamels were very important in education. Their root is in New Orleans, and so we need to see these families, brothers, sisters, working as uncles or adopted, like with Dr. Clarke. He adopted us as a part of his extended family. And
Yeah,
so
now that's very important, because that's something, again, that a lot of us don't know. And it's showing John Henry Clarke's genesis and development. Now, getting back to Kwame Nkrumah, why don't you get into the ethnic group he came from, his background in Ghana, and what inspired him to come to the United States, Nkrumah?
well, since you have made a very strong point about making these connections, it's important to know that Nkrumah had a special connection in terms of his higher education. And that connection comes from an African. Now, he's from Ghana. He's a part of the Akan group that's the largest group in the central part of Ghana. In the capital, Accra, you have the Ewe, and as you go out to the Togolese border, the Ewe are on both sides. When you go through the center, you have the various groups related to the Asante. And then as you get further going toward Ivory Coast, you have the Asante groups that split off and became part of the Ivory Coast. So there's a nice web of ethnic groups that are cousins to each other, and they maintain this fantastic relations, a complementary relationship. And so Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was from one of the smallest, the Nzima, one of the smallest groups in this whole mountain of ethnic groups, but he was he had his mother again was an inspiration for him, and she was going to make sure that he connected to his uncle, because the uncle is a special relationship in the Akan a line of family, and so he was able to go to Achimoto College, but it really was a secondary school. Achimoto trained Africans for the future. And so he was good enough to pass the exams to get into Achimoto. But the beautiful thing, in Achimoto, you had an African. And that African, Agre of Africa, that African had gone to America. And most people don't realize he went to the small colleges in North Carolina, Livingstone College. And of course, he became a giant at that school because of his African roots, but also these African American schools were trying to expand and trying to have a greater reach. And so he was in Livingstone when they were expanding, not just in the regular BA or BS, but they even added a theological school to the Livingstone complex. But Agre of Africa came from Africa and went to Livingstone and married an African American woman. And he was there for almost 20 years. And during that time, many people were blessed by his presence of having an African consciousness from a place like Ghana, and then having married into the African American culture. So I had a funeral 2 years ago, and it was at Livingstone. My cousin was a minister, graduated from their theological institute. He had changed his name from, his brother's name was Leonard, like mine, because they were twins, and his name was Lawrence. But he had gotten so African consciousness as a minister, he changed his name to Odinga. And he made sure that that respect for African traditions was real. And he grew up in Livingston, where this consciousness of Africanness was real. And so I went there for the funeral for Odinga, and I said, I've got to go to Agre. I've got to go to his grave. And the college was so glad that I was there. They knew of my reputation. And I said, I want to go. They said, well, we're not sure which one at the end of the campus, there's a graveyard, and he's there, but we're not sure which one. Of course, my curiosity was I had to go into the graveyard and find him. And I did, and my heart just leaped. Agre of Africa, I met the family in Ghana. They were in the Anamabo area. And what was beautiful was I looked across the campus and I saw this row of fantastic, beautiful, large homes. And I said, oh, I wonder what that's all about. So I left the campus and went across the street, and there was a big plaque that this beautiful house was where Agre of Africa lived with his wife before he returned to Ghana. And it's so marvelous to see all of this family relationship that we don't have a clue, but it's significant. And so I was able to, luckily, I have my little athletic background. And so when I was on the campus, going from house to house, these important houses, and you could see in the backyard, they had 2 fireplaces, they had barbecues for 200 people so you had this African connection, and Agri of Africa became an important part of that. And he finally decided to take the knowledge he had in America and go back and provide that leadership in the school that Nkrumah was.
So what was his influence on Nkrumah?
Nkrumah was able to know the value of an African-American education. And so the school that he eventually went to was Lincoln. And so Lincoln, again, was an important African-American education. And one of the great leaders that came out of Lincoln was Zeke.
Yeah.
Was he, and I think Nkrumah might have missed him by a year or two. But the fact that great Nigerian leaders and great Ghanaian leaders and others went to these African-American schools was something that we do not even consider in part of our flow of knowledge. But
and Ezekwe helped him, with his admission material and stuff like that when he was applying for the university. And by the way, you probably know this, when Agre died, Nkrumah was then getting a degree in religion. He had already got a degree from Lincoln, and he was also teaching. And so they went out and performed a libation over Agre's grave. You know this?
Yes.
And it got his teacher very angry because he's coming from a strict Christian perspective and considered this to be non-Christian. And this really created a problem with, Nkrumah, because Nkrumah said, this is the culture of Africa. We're doing a libation to our ancestors. And how dare you say that this is uncivilized? Because I think that was basically what was happening. So that created, towards the end of his stay at Temple, at Lincoln, it created a problem for Nkrumah just around that particular thing. But for 2 days, Nkrumah couldn't eat when he heard about Agre's death. 2 days he couldn't eat.
Yes. And eventually, when he became the president, he was able to go to, and Kruma was able to go to Livingstone, and they had dedicated a new student center building to him. And that, when I saw the cornerstone, it said 1961. So Nkrumah came to America for a visit with the UN and all of that, but he made sure he got down to the Carolinas and was honored in this new building. And so we have to be able to see this connection, which we don't know.
So go into what you see as the impact of Lincoln University on Nkrumah, in his development.
Well, I can do a very personal thing, but it may take some time, but it's necessary. And Kruma had a great personality. I mean, he was a playboy in a sense, because he liked to wear the robes and this and that. But so here are 2 of the books of Nkrumah that are very important. His life and work of Kwame Nkrumah. And then there's another one, the autobiography. And so when you read of what he had to go through when he came back to Ghana and he was attempting to get to America, the sacrifices he had to make and his family made to get him. And he talks about the difficulty of trying to get to America. And that's, so now we're trying to get to Africa in any way we can. And so the reverse was there, because these Africans wanted to be able to have that fight that the African Americans have in their culture. And so when Nkrumah became the president of Ghana, and he wanted to thank the African American component of his struggle. And so when they had the midnight taking down of the Union Jack, that's the British flag. And so all the minds of, Ghana was focusing on that Union Jack being pulled down. And then Nkrumah, with his prison buddies, the Big Six had gone to prison and they were ready to make a stand. They refused to come out in tuxedos or even the cloth. They wore their prison gowns when they raised up the flag of Ghana, which was attached to, again, an overseas connection. It was attached to the star, the black star of Garvey was woven into that. Now, who was there? Did he invite a special guest? He had a crew from America. Who was there? Someone called King. Not Bernard King, the basketball player, but Martin Luther King was there. Who was there? The Johnsons. Well, not the Johnsons we usually think of, at the Johnson floor wax or whatever. No, Johnson of Ebony was there. Who was there? Johnson of Howard. Mordecai Johnson was there. And these Black folk proudly joined in this new nation that was going to change the world, because 1957 was an important date because of so much was going on in 1957. And so we have to begin to see what I refer to that period as the 50-year turning point of history. 1945, the Manchester conferences and other conferences, through to the great nation building process, started early on by Gamal Nasser in Naguib in Egypt. And for the first time in 2,000 years, Black people ruled in Egypt. And so that was a great inspiration for Kwame Nkrumah, because he got heavy into this worldview. And how did Lincoln help him get to worldview? It was, again, moving among the Black community. There was one of our friends, Philpott, and Philpott had a nice big car, and he was able to leave Howard and go to Lincoln, and then get Nkrumah, and then bring him to Howard, so he could.
Philpott? Who was Philpott?
Philpott was just one of the brothers who was in the mix, prominent in the elite of the Black elite of Howard. So he became the person who went and got him and brought him to Howard so he could sit down with Leo Hansberry and the Hansberry group. And who was a part of the Hansberry group? Among them was a person who was called upon to be a part of the international community when the end of World War II was taking place. And so you had this brother, one of the key figures internationally. He was a part of the Hansberry group. Who was there? The old man who wrote The Destruction of Black Civilization was a part of the group.
Who was a student of Hansberry's.
So Ralph Bunche, we think of him as an international servant, but Ralph Bunche was a part of the Hansberry group. He had his office next to Hansberry. So
he was a radical before he got into international politics. Some of his analysis of the Black elite and everything was very critical. You know? Right.
So this sacred triangle, because I believe in this sacred triangle that comes out of the Nile Valley. This sacred triangle was Howard to Lincoln and back to Howard. Okay. Philpott also would take him into Philadelphia. Well, who was there? What important force was there? W.E.B. Du Bois. His base was the University of Pennsylvania. He wrote his book, The Philadelphia Negro, was his great work, and among his great works, and it's important for me because he also did a study of my mother's hometown in Virginia. So a section of that study that he did was about the roots of Black migration out of the South. And he did a special case of the Black people leaving the South with the various skills and interests, and then coming into the 7th district of Philadelphia, which was the Black district. And he did a fantastic comparison of the health factors and other factors.
Du Bois's work on that is the best work on sociology of the 19th or 20th century, the Philadelphia Negro. And Nkrumah got a master's degree at Pennsylvania, at university. Yes. And he did a study. He got paid not much, but he went door to door in the Black community there, studying the conditions of Black people. Kwame Nkrumah did, so that he got familiar with, and of course he faced his own racist treatment. He got familiar with the conditions of Black people in this country at a deep level. And as John said, he was so broke that when he would date, he could only afford to walk a sister down the street and buy her an ice cream cone. And as you said, he liked sisters, you know what I mean? And that brokenness contributed to his development because he was with the grassroots. It was hard living for him. He had to work on, ocean liners during the summer that would treat between New York and Mexico, serving liquor or serving food, and then doing harder work than that. He worked so hard that at one point they committed him to the hospital and had him under an oxygen lung because he had nearly worked himself to death, But that gave him the contacts with everyday Black folks.
Right. And I think but there's always a little exaggeration in people. So I have him moving from that triangle between Lincoln and Howard and then coming to Philadelphia. But his big move was to come to the Big Apple, to come to New York.
Right.
Now,
naturally,
people want to glamorize him coming to New York and then sleeping on the subways. Look, if he did sleep on the subways, that wasn't his own choice. He was a student of the Bible. He went to college to become a minister. Anybody knowing Harlem and anybody knowing the consciousness about an African studying the Bible at one of our schools, he would have no trouble. He could go to any church and on a Saturday, and they would make sure that you come on Sunday, and we'll take care of you. And so he didn't have to sleep on the subway. He might have once or twice, but he could go into church and say, he's from Africa? Oh my God. They say, wait a minute, you got to come back tomorrow. I'm going to share my sermon with you. And then you got to stay and get some food. We're going to feed you. And you're going to go away with enough food to last you for. So he was received by the Black community with a lot of love and respect. So that relationship in Harlem was enormous. My wife grew up on 115th Street, and she said there were 5 major church groups on that, dancing in the street, of this and that. So Harlem at that time had a very strong religious base, and Daddy Grace and all of these other groups were there to make sure that somebody from Africa, wow. And of course, part of that mix is Abyssinian Baptist Church, which is 138th Street. And so Dr. Clark lived on 137th Street. And Abyssinian Baptist Church was started by Abyssinian seamen from Ethiopia. And they wanted to have a spiritual center because Dr. Oba has talked about the importance of of Ethiopia and the consciousness coming out of Ethiopia, which should be probably a special lecture in a program in and of itself. But Abyssinian has a Coptic cross right in the pulpit, and that cross was brought in by Haile Selassie himself. They have a picture of him and others bringing the Coptic cross down, and it stood in that pulpit while the father was running the church, Adam Clayton Powell, and when he inherited the church and he moved past his father, Adam Clayton Powell went into a heavy political church process. And that meant he got a political position as a congressman from Harlem, and he was able to produce, because of his skill, produce 67, 68 major pieces of legislation.
More legislation.
Ever had.
More legislation for blacks and poor than any person in Congress. And Adam Clayton Powell was a collaborator with Malcolm X. And Malcolm, for him, that was his model of what black politics should be. I've noted this before. I don't know if you know this, Leonard, but the brother who played a big part in organizing the Sixth Pan African Congress, which we won't go into here, Paulu, who came from the Caribbean and held a position in Parliament until he cussed out the Queen. He was in Africa and met Malcolm in '64. And guess what Malcolm told him? Him and Adam Clayton Powell were preparing a Black Power conference.
Okay, yes.
And so when Willie Ricks hears Black Power coming from Adam Clayton Powell after Malcolm's assassination at Howard University, Black Power Conference, and then in '66, they're going through Mississippi, this March Against Fear, picking up Meredith's thing after he'd been shot in the back by some right-wingers. I'm in Washington, D.C., then lobbying Congress to build a 220-unit cooperative Marcus Garvey Martin Luther King complex. And I'm saying, March Against Fear, this is a joke. Black people had dealt with fear, but then when they stood up one night, and Stokely, Kwame Nkrumah told me later, Willie whispered in his ear, Willie Ricks, he said, say Black Power. And Kwame told me, he said, really kind of crazy. I don't know if I should have said that, but I said it. And then Black Power going to get your mama, Black Power is going to get everything. So that was a collaboration between the two of them, but you know, the idea had to come from Malcolm. And I never got a chance to tell Kwame Nkrumah, Stokely Carmichael that, because every time we'd stay, we'd talk, I forgot to tell him that. He didn't know that genesis, but we all knew Malcolm's spirit was there. So Abyssinia Black Baptist Church, Ethiopia, all of that, all of this, a big influence on Kwame Nkrumah. Now, just one thing, Garvey. What was some of the influence of Garvey on Nkrumah?
Well, fortunately, Kwame had his hands full in terms of trying to lay the foundations for this new nation, and this new nation was going to be a leader of the African movement. But Garvey, because of the culture in the Caribbean around festivals and other activities, and because we had in our culture parades marching through the streets, the churches, the Masons, all these various groups, our culture is a fantastic. It's not a sit on your butt culture. It's a get up and move culture. It's a marching and showing out culture. It's dressing up. You're not going to put on your worst clothes. You're going to get the best thing that you got, and you're going to be marching through the streets. And so Garvey was able to tap into the consciousness of this Harlem. They talk about the rising consciousness of Harlem, the new age, in fact. And so new buildings going up and new concentrations. So that Garvey was an important part of nationalism, and that nationalism was not restricted to Jamaicans. It was spread across the Caribbean. And so when you eventually get the Fifth Pan-African Conference, here you have 250 of these brothers and sisters from all these different African nations, including the Caribbean. And so Garvey's vision of a United States of Africa and the African peoples moving to the world with dignity and whatnot, that was very clear. And to show how that works after World War, in other words, the Americans don't like to arm Black folks. And Black folks like to get armed because they like to go hunting. But they also were being armed to fight the American wars. And when the war was over, they were proud Black people walking through the streets. And even if there was a parade or something, they would be a part of it. The biggest parade was the end of the war. And the French had told the Americans, if you have no use for your Black troops, your Black men, we do. We have 1 million or 2 million African men in arms that are helping to keep France alive. And the price of that was that there would be an independence for Africans after the war. And America said that we don't want Black people to be armed. And so the French said, well, give them to us. So Black troops in World War I fought with the French. They were not good enough to fight with the Americans. But when the war was over, these brothers were so fantastic as fighters that they led the victory parade up Fifth Avenue. They led the white troops up Fifth Avenue, and they paraded in French uniform with French regimental formations, and they did not stop at 110th Street, which is the end of the park. They kicked it through Harlem. They went through 110th Street, past 116th Street, past 125th Street, past 135th Street, onto 145th, and there is a monument, an obelisk has been placed at that juncture as a tribute to the Harlem Hell Fighters. And so when these brothers like that had this experience, they wasn't going to sit at the back of no bus. They wasn't going to have their people shot down by gangs of Ku Klux Klan. They were going to react to it. So the Garvey movement comes on top of this movement of Black consciousness in terms of the war.
Now, let me interject something here. There's a 7 or 8 volume work on Garvey that is extremely important. And in one of the chapters, one of the volumes, you have Garvey attending a meeting of Hubert Harrison, the Liberty League in New York. And Garvey's getting ready to lead the United States. I've made this statement before on this show, but it's important to restate this here because this is generally not known. Mm-hmm. Garvey had not succeeded, and this is at the end of World War I, he had not succeeded in connecting with a mass base of Blacks. He had traveled the country, he had assessed the state of Blacks, but he was having trouble getting his movement off the ground. One of the reasons is he hadn't really piped into a couple of things, one of which was the post-World War I anti-war sentiment that came when these Blacks came back from World War I and felt betrayed by the NAACP and others that said, fight to make the world safe for democracy. And they're facing these bloody summers where they're fighting back. And there was the emergence of what Hubert Harrison, who was from the Caribbean, one of the sharpest minds that we had at that time, a leader of the Liberty League, called the New Negro. So Garvey attends his Liberty League meeting, and they're then protesting lynching, and they are anti-war now. And so Garvey gets his first contact with the mass sentiments of blacks. Now, when Garvey came to this country, he was pro-war. He supported World War I. He supported the King of England. And he wrote him a letter and told him how much he loved him. But what happens is the mass of blacks radicalized Garvey on two things, and Hubert Harrison played a big part in this: race consciousness and anti-war stance, and those two things are what shot Garvey's movement off and, got him the major following and enabled him to send a delegation, at least one or two people that got to the Paris Peace Conference, to demand that they give part of Africa back to Africans abroad, which they didn't, but it gave him the attention that really launched his movement. So the point here is that Garvey, in the end, would play a very important role in waking blacks up. But in the beginning, black people woke him up. And that's generally not understood. And in Kruma, when he comes here, he gets his first exposure to racism. And then when he goes to Britain, he gets more of an exposure. He sees it through a Ghanaian perspective, but it is also a part of his politicizing, around what's happening in this country. So this interaction is very important. Now, let's get to the Fifth Pan-African Congress, because I want to really get to...
No, we will, but we got to give this one fellow a little bit of a break. And his name was, Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
In other words, most people don't realize that folks from the Caribbean were recruited to help build the Panama Canal. And of course, white folks instituted their apartheid system. All the people working to dig this enormous canal, but white folks got paid in gold and black folk got paid in silver. But because of their importance in helping with the canal, they were allowed citizenship in America. And so this was the agreement. But because white folks know how to turn away from an agreement, and they do it all the time, white folks were scared of white folks, because anarchists and other people coming out of Europe were the people that were going to come into America and wake up white Americans. So they passed the Immigration Acts of 1920 and 21, which went against the agreement of making citizens of those who built the canal. So Booker T fought and used the Tuskegee machine to make sure that the migration into America was carried out. So that's a part of the flow of history that these are the flows of history that we have to be able to see. Don't see people in one dimension, see them over periods of time and in different circumstances and situations.
And Booker T built up Harlem because through his National Negro Business League, they helped to block bust Harlem to bring Black people in there. So, and there was a number of other things he did on the positive level that is generally not known, but that's another one. Yeah.
And the brother that you did want to mention, you mentioned his name, and we should give him respect, even though he was such a Garveyite, and he left Pan-Africanism in the breeze because he was so tight in Garvey. That's Robert Hill, Dr. Robert Hill. He based himself in UCLA, and he had the...
Yeah, he's the one that wrote the volumes on Garvey.
Right, the 10, that's what I was...
Excellent works.
Yes, but the person who had the spirit of Garvey and the nationalism and involvement in the Black American community as well as the Caribbean community is Dr. Tony Martin.
And by the way, if you look at this poster behind me, the person right above Haile Selassie is Tony Martin. He's above Maulana Karenga.
Yes.
See right there. And he wrote the book Race First, which I think is one of the best works on Garvey, showing how the J. Edgar Hoover, then the Internal Bureau of Investigation, before it was the Federal Bureau, gave the District Attorney of New York the basis for moving on Garvey, for setting him up on using the mails to defraud. So Yeah, Tony Martin, great scholar, you know. Yeah.
So the struggle that we've waged has been an enormous one and a relatively successful one because we didn't have any allies. We had to look for ourselves, and so that this layout that you have is enormous now.
So let's get to the Fifth Pan-African Congress and talk about Nkrumah's role in the Fifth Pan-African Congress, his relationship to George Padmore, his relationship to the Black community in the UK, which, by the way, we have a sizable following of Blacks from the UK that watch this show, but who have been engaged in interaction with us, you know, Black folks in this country for a long time. So
Yes.
what was that? What was going on there? Because, you know, we discussed briefly the Fifth Pan-African Congress the last time, but I wanted to go into some of these dynamics because it helped shape Nkrumah.
It did, and it's an important part of looking at our sweep of history. That's why I say there's a 50-year turning point of history, 1945 to 1995. And that's when the history has moved in favor of Black struggle, wherever, in England, in Brazil, and wherever. And so that 50-year turning point of history, I refer to it also as the Malcolm X era, but Malcolm X, Garvey, and a whole host of W.E.B. Du Bois, because he eventually, whatever limitations he had, he eventually joined the movement in a serious way. And Kruma invited him to come to Ghana. He did. He lived out his life in Ghana. I was there when he passed and got on a plane, knowing that he had just made his transition. By the time I got to Kennedy Airport, there was so much excitement at the airport because they had just had the March on Washington, Martin Luther King's March on Washington, that even white cabbies and people were excited about what had happened. So I was physically in the transition of Du Bois leaving and King emerging. And
Can I interject something here? Because what you're making is a very important point. I've been in the movement now 61 years. My father was fighting by himself with his fist against the Klan when he was 12 and standing up, refusing to fight in World War II. He didn't have any wind behind him. He was standing on his own. And the turning point that you're talking about, that turning point where the end of World War II, you have basically the fall of Europe,
yes,
Britain especially, the rise of America, but only a 27-year rise. But it's a window now where the winds of change in the world give us the opportunity to do things we couldn't do before. I would have never been able to do what I did, San Francisco Freedom Movement. Malcolm X couldn't have done what he did. The Montgomery Bus Boy couldn't have done what it did. And the African independence movements, because there's a shift of power in the world. And that shift of power is even more pronounced now as America is going down. And if you've noticed, just recently, Biden has announced this Three Eyes, unification with him and Australia and others against China. China's rising, America's in decline. But what you need to understand is this is an era where your power is on the rise. It's a question of how conscious you are of it. So what Dr. J is talking about, this ain't no joke. We all talking about white supremacy. I don't use that term anymore. White people ain't supreme anymore. And no other people in the world use that term but them. Genghis Khan never talked about Mongol supremacy, and they conquered more square real estate than the white boy did. But now you imprison yourself with that term, they're going down. Their power is going down. And so the question is, what do we do with that? And that's why we're looking at these two great leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, and we'll get to Julius Nyerere, and what their legacy means for Pan-Africanism going forward as well as before. So Nkrumah, how was he influenced by what was going on in the UK? What was his role, Sixth Pan-African Congress? What was his relationship to Padmore, and so forth?
Well, and that's would be a beautiful study for any of us. The elder scholars need to look at it again, younger scholars. People need to understand that these special relationships need to be appreciated. Padmore, with his roots in the Caribbean, is an enormous figure, but he's not really studied the way he should be. He was so powerful that at the time of World War II and after, he was on the Comintern. The Comintern is the ruling body of communism.
He was a colonel, highest ranking African in the world in the Comintern.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing, though, was that he still had his consciousness. He didn't get sucked into the communist world. He had this Africanist gnawing at him, and that paid off. And so he was able to break, because he saw what was happening in terms of Russia, even though they might have had a theoretical Marxism or so-called socialism, but it was clear when he looked at it with wide eyes open and seriousness that it was white Russian nationalism.
Because when Russia finds themselves betrayed after they reach a pact with Hitler, Hitler invades their country, they now give the Comintern directions, and that is that the enemies of Africans should be regarded as our friends, the French, the British, everything else, and you should put your independence movement on the back burner, work with them while they work to try and save Russia, and Russia works to try and save the West. So he put the nationalism and the Pan-Africanism of Africans first. And he said, no, we're not on any back burner. And that's the point you're making. Yeah.
Right. And the beautiful thing is, when you go through the Caribbean, you have people like Padmore, but you have others like Ras McConnell.
Right.
And he was a special personality. And yes, and then people, if they can, get a hold of Ras McConnell's Pan-Africanism from within. And he talks about the relationship that these brothers and sisters had to go through. And he came from Guyana, so he had this business mindset, this economic mindset, part of the struggles in that culture between the East Indians.
That's his autograph of the book.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Yes, yes, you need to make
Six
copies.
Pan African Congress, you know.
That's right. That's fantastic. But see, that's what gives us great pleasure, to be able to make these connections and let our people know. One book will not do it. You need to study with me. What has happened, which is fantastic, is that my partner in the Black Studies department at City College was an RAF pilot. He was at the Pan African Conference, Professor Edward Scobie. And the person who has adopted me as a son, we lost him a few years ago, but his name was Dudley Thompson. He was not only important in terms of the Pan-African Conference, he was important in saving Jomo Kenyatta's life and trying to work with the Mau Mau. He got a legal team to help the Mau Mau. That's Dudley Thompson. And then he had a key position in terms of the government in Jamaica. And, but he's born, we went to see a play on Thurgood Marshall in Manhattan. And then when we had our little sip of juice or whatever after, my wife and I and his wife at the moment, then he says to me, do you know we're born on the same day? I said, no, we're not. He said, yes, I was born January the 19th, 1917. And so that just bonded us. And so he became the leader of our world organization, World African Diaspora Union. We were able to move with him around the world when there was a big conference in Dakar or any place. he went with us. He took us along. And so we have to be able to see this awakening. And Professor Scobie, who is from a little island in the Caribbean, Dominica, but he got into the RAF. He was knocking German planes out of the sky. But after the war, he became a publisher. So he started writing books on the Black presence in Britain, the Black genius groups, the Black St. Maurice, and all of these Black part of the European culture. And so for him to, he was at Princeton and at Rutgers, but then I convinced him, I said, come on to New York. And since he lived in New York, he was able to leave the Princeton and Rutgers position with Van Sertima and join us at City College in developing one of the most comprehensive.
Now in Kruma and Padmore, what was their relationship, and what was Nkrumah's role in the Fifth Pan-African Congress? We know Padmore was principal organizer, but what was Nkrumah's role?
Padmore was a principal organizer because he had this larger consciousness that involved the European world. And Kruma, because of his personality and his youth, had a special role to play. And so he was like the secretariat, the person who would be handling things. And of course, the Garvey wife was there also. They tried to bring in as many different people as possible. But if you're planning a conference that's going to last for several weeks, you need logistics. And that's when Ross McConnell came in, because he not only had a so-called saloon, but it was more than a saloon, because in England you have these saloons and they become inns. So you can have a bar downstairs, and upstairs you got sleeping quarters, or you could have a space for catering. And so Ross McConnell was able to make sure that they were housed right wherever they came from, and they weren't starving, and they were treated like leaders. And so when we see this connection to make this international process work, and then you see Du Bois coming in at the last minute, but he was glad to put his stamp on it. Du Bois called for the Encyclopedia Africana, and he started it at his age.
By the way, I have a copy of his notes. When I was in Ghana, we got to get a copy of his notes, book notes on that. Yeah, very important. Now, the point you're making about Ross McConnell is, without him, there wouldn't have been a Fifth Pan-African Congress, because he provided the financing. And without that, no finance, no politics. You know what I mean?
You could have had a convention or whatever you want to call it, but it wouldn't have the international status that this conference had, because you had people who knew how to handle money and resources and to make it work. And to have Professor Scobie, RAF pilot, there, and then have him as my deputy at the Black Studies Department, and then to have my international work supported by Dudley Thompson, who, when he went to a conference, the people stopped the conference. He went to a conference in Senegal, and they stopped the conference. They had the camera, and the camera focused on him, and then they said, "Oop, that's Dudley Thompson." And then they went next door to Dudley, and that was Dr. Julius Garvey. So the relationships, the personal relationships that we have had to model is something that we need to appreciate. And out of it came institutions of every type. One thing that we will not deal with at this juncture is that 1945 was an important time for independence struggles in the English-speaking world. But 1946, the French-speaking world, African French-speaking world, was getting its payback, because it was the troops, the Senegalese tirailleurs, and the other Africans who joined to save France. It is one of the great stories that nobody really talks about.
And now going back to Nkrumah and Padmore, I think it's important to note a couple of things. When Nkrumah decides to leave the US, it's right after he nearly dies. They had put him in an oxygen mask and everything. He resolved it's time for him to leave. he goes to London. He goes to London initially to go to law school
Yes.
and to take other courses, because Nkrumah, it should be noted, he got 4 degrees while he was in the US, 2 bachelor degrees, 2 master's degrees, and had completed all work for a PhD, except that he didn't have time to finish his to turn in his dissertation. So
Right.
what that tells you is he was hungry for knowledge. He was in there for knowledge, and he had to work hard, even though he got a scholarship from Temple, to maintain his presence on a university campus. So when he goes to London, one of the students at Lincoln had recommended that he go and get a barrister's degree. And so he signs up for that, but he gets involved in political action. The first thing he does is he sends a letter to George Padmore and tells him he's coming. And could he meet him at the train station? And Padmore is at the train station. And this is what Nkrumah says: I could see when our eyes connect, he was a good person. He said, we had a good relationship. And that was the beginning of an ongoing relationship, because as you said, he was the secretariat person. He was the person who was doing a lot of administrative work and stuff like that. While Nkrumah's in London, he forms the Circle. And the Circle is patterned after Lenin, because he's also being influenced by socialism and Marxist ideas. And so these are a group of Africans who are meeting to really talk about the independence movement, how Africa is going to move forward. At the same time, Nkrumah's active in the Black community in the UK. And so you have cases where people are being arrested by the so-called police and being mistreated. So Nkrumah's there along with others, but he's leading it, representing the needs of the Black community. So he was loved, by Black folks. And then, of course, he's an understudy for Padmore. And then when he gets the invitation to come back to Ghana, it's one of his classmates that recommends him to Dankwa. He says, there's a promising young man here. He's very active, because he had come from Lincoln. He was now in London. And he's saying, very promising. And Dankwa's looking for someone to help organize the movement in Ghana for independence, to put him in as president of Ghana. And so all of this is coming from Nkrumah's activism. So Nkrumah notes that it's really this phase in Britain that really shapes him politically. And he doesn't have the time anymore to go to class, because his classroom is organizing. And so and then the other thing is, him and Padmore, they both make a decision that they want to see that as many grassroots Africans take part in the 5th Pan African Congress, because the previous ones had been largely Blacks from the West, Caribbean and the US, but educated Black folks, but they also wanted grassroots, trade union people, stuff like that. And so they were able to pull that off. The other thing is, the West African Students Union, which was like the African Student Union, which Nkrumah had formed in the US, the African Student Union, they played a major role in voting Churchill out of office. And so that gives them leverage with the labor government that comes in. And so Nkrumah's getting interaction and other Africans there with the labor government, which they're going to be negotiating independence with shortly. So this phase here is very, very important. By the way, he stayed in a 1-bedroom place during that 2 years. He was lucky to find a place, because the British is racist as here. And so it was his one little bedroom place. And Kruma was never really concerned about the comforts of life. He was more into the freedom of his people. The other thing that should be noted, when he applies to Lincoln, one of his points, and this is a point that wouldn't get him into any white college, was he wanted an education at Lincoln because he wanted to go back and throw the British out of Ghana. And Lincoln liked that. You understand? They liked that. So that was also a part of Kwame Nkrumah. One other thing, he won the debating contest. He came out tops at Lincoln. He was a good speaker and good on his feet.
Yes.
So this phase for Nkrumah is very important. So when he goes back to Ghana, let's get into what he is doing when he comes back and Kruma comes back to Ghana. I'll get into Nyerere after this. We spent more time on Nkrumah deliberately, but we're going to get into Nyerere because Nyerere's contribution is really not appreciated. And of all the leaders, I think he had one of the best strategies for Africa. This strategy will still work. It's not the whole answer, but it's part of the answer. So let's talk about Nkrumah in Ghana and what he does when he comes back. What's his role in terms of the independence movement itself?
One of the important things that we should note that Nkrumah and the Pan Africanists were not the only people organizing. Before and after their organizing, labor was organizing. So there was a conference of Black labor unionists that laid the way for this Pan-African conference to becoming even more large than it was. They had the initial conference, it was successful. I have a whole document on their program and what they did. And in a few months after that, that foundation helped the Pan-African conference that we're focusing on. And the labor movements in English-speaking Africa and French-speaking Africa have to be seen as active nationalists. And so we usually miss over that because the prestige of the Fifth Pan-African Conference, et cetera. But students were organizing, and labor unions were organizing to go along with the organizing that the brothers that we're focusing on really had an important role. And if we're going to get to Nyerere because we want to finish up with him, but you can't appreciate the fight for independence in the French-speaking areas without the same process that we're talking about in the English-speaking area. They had an agreement with France that we will help to save you if you put independence in the works for us. But of course, the French meant independence means you are dependent upon the French, but you're not going to have a real independence. C.O.R.E said, I want real independence. I don't want the French Union. But the French were prepared to give the Africans freedom because they would have lost the war against the Nazis if the Africans had not. And what Ufot-Bwani, who was a rival and a complement to his counter in Ghana, Ufot-Bwani, the president of because he also was the one that made the arrangement with de Gaulle that French manhood and French independence cannot be real unless you link up the Africans. And you can't do it. Churchill wants to keep you down in England. The Germans want to run through the Dutch to get to England. But what Ufot says, you got to be prepared to go into the heart of darkness and then make your turn back into yourself. And by that, he meant you got to come into the Congo Basin, into Brazzaville. And from Brazzaville, we can help you plan the restoration of French manhood. So here you have a little Ufot-Bwani, 5'6", and a 6'6" giant called de Gaulle. But the manhood of the French came by using the independence point that they, in 1946, they had a meeting on it and they agreed to come up with the French independence as they came up with the English independence. So that's something.
Now a key point there is that when Nkrumah is in the UK for the Fifth Pan-African Congress, during that particular time, prior to it and after, he goes to France. And at one point he gets directives to, and another time he does it on his own. In both cases, he meets with Bourguignon and with Leopold Senghor. And what he's trying to do is to get a Pan-African Federation of West Africa. And so, and that was a view that both French West Africans and English-speaking West Africans had. And so that was also part of his contribution. And he even tried to get a Congress to take place in Nigeria that would be a few years after the Fifth Pan-African Congress. But so let's go back to Nkrumah. He gets invited by Dankwa to come back to head up at least the organizing of his party. So let's talk about that. What happens? Nkrumah comes back, and there's a move to organize a movement for independence. Talk about that. What was Nkrumah's role in that?
And Kruma, because he had this worldview of having traveled, and he had this worldview of having these different perspectives, he was prepared to come back to Ghana and have this elite, Dankwa and others, to work with them. But he also had an ego, and he, seeing these brothers as the old school, they were well educated, had appreciation. They were the type of Africans in the in the English speaking areas who would wear the white wigs, the powdered wigs, as part of the Supreme Court regalia and whatnot. And so, Nkrumah got very ambitious, and he was able to organize past Dankwa. And by doing so, he made one mistake. He had no links to Ashanti. And he needed that, because the Fanti are strong, but the powerful group, two very powerful groups in Ghana, the Fanti are on the coast, the Ashanti are in the middle of the nation where all the wealth is, the gold and the cocoa and whatnot, and the timber. And then up north, you had the Muslim groups. So, Nkrumah was able to see the potential of pulling off a leadership group around himself. And the tragedy is that he was able to do it, and he was able to implement his great plan. And so I was blessed to be able to be in Africa in 1961. My wife had been there in 1960. We were the same program, Operation Crossroads Africa. And then I was leader of the group in Ivory Coast. And at the end of the summer, you're supposed to take a month. You work for a month and a half, and then you travel for a month. And so we traveled throughout West Africa. The leader of the group, the old German guy, wanted us to go to Timbuktu, but we didn't have $85 to get on a plane to go to Timbuktu. I had, as a part of my, I had $25 for the whole summer. And 15 of that, 15 of that $25 went to get this. This is what I brought home, this Ivy elephant. And so there was no way in hell. I told the group, we're not going to go to Timbuktu. The old man was he had to get to Timbuktu, so he said, we're going to go by road. Well, that was a reasonable idea, except during the rainy season, there are no roads. And so we tried to go through up to Mali, Ojani, and up on into Mali. We had to knock on the doors of the English leaders to get a place to stay. We had the sleeping nets, we had the water, we had these canteens full of this brown water. We had to put a tea bag in because the water wasn't purified. But finally, he gave up. They told him, you can't go through Niger. The rains have come. And so we cut across Niger, and then we went down to the top of Togo, and then we went down to Dahomey, all the way to the coast. And then we came across, and then we went into C. Nkrumah's dream plan. And this was this dam And so we
River
went,
Project.
what was that?
Volta River Project.
Right, the Volta River Project. And so when we crossed the border from Togo to Ghana, I saw a big sign advertising Walls Ice Cream, and it was packed ice cream. So I said, Ghana is really the joint. They got decent ice cream, and so we don't have to have that little French icy. We can have some real ice cream. And so the older guy said that I give you a choice. You can go get some Ghanaian food, or you can go follow Jeffries to get some blueberry muffins and ice cream. So when all of the group went with me, they left the old guy doing his thing. But we finally were able to get to the Volta River Project. And there we were on this bluff. And there are these two big billboards. And the billboards say, look straight ahead. And you'll see the mountain ranges, two mountain ranges coming together. And these mountain ranges will be joined by an earth-filled dam and be on the Volta River. And with this earth-filled dam, a 150-mile lake will be created. And that will allow us to have fishing and all kinds of things there. And then the power of the water power will produce the thermal energy necessary for this dam to produce electricity. It was a magnificent thing, but it was billboards. And for me to imagine this happening, I said, it ain't gonna happen. I just spent a whole summer in Africa and they don't have roads. And they certainly don't have a super electronic hydroelectric power. But Nkrumah stuck to his plan. The problem was that Gamal Nasser had come up with the Aswan Dam. And so that was a problem because the Russians said they'll build the Aswan Dam. And Gamal Nasser and Naguib had taken over ruling Egypt. And for the first time in 2,000 years, Black people were ruling Egypt. And so the fear that the Russians would build the dam, and Kruma and others were able to use, and for fear that the Russians would build the dam in Ghana, they agreed, the consortium of five, the big five, US, Britain, France, and Belgium, because of their control of the Belgian Congo. And so they agreed that the Americans and the Canadians and the British and whatnot, French, would build Nkrumah's dream. And they did it. They actually built it, but it was a tragedy for Nkrumah because Rouse and I had just made a trip visiting 12 nations, and then Ghana was the last one, and we were going to go back to our house in Ivory Coast. But Ghana and Ivory Coast are on the same border. So we said, look, we're tired. Let's go home and let's not worry about trying to do Ghana now. We can come by road next week to Ghana. So we said goodbye to our friends, and we went to the airport and got on the plane, and our friends were saying, get home safe. We don't know what's going to happen in Ghana. I said, what do you mean? He said, Nkrumah has taken 60 to 70 of the leadership of Ghana with him to Peking with the idea of going to Ho Chi Minh in Indochina and helping him end the war. And that was kind of unnecessary because Ho Chi Minh didn't allow Mao Zedong to tell him how to handle his war. They beat the Japanese, they beat back a whole other people, and the French at Dien Bien Phu, they took care of the French. So what had happened was, while Nkrumah was away being entertained by the leaders of the Third World Movement that he was a part of, just as the brothers had told me, this is a perfect time for a coup. The coup actually took place. By the time we were flying up in the air, and we could see out to my left and looking out the window, the toll road, a stream of light coming from the Tema toll road, one of the only toll roads in Africa. Again, that's an achievement of Nkrumah. And then as we're flying higher in the air and I'm looking down and I see this burst of light, that was Job 600. He was actually building the capital of Africa. They were building suites, 25 or 30 suites for the African leaders. They were building an assembly hall, etc. And this was his biggest building project outside of the dam. Or he did have a whole area where he was building factories. And he had another area where they were building housing to show how modern housing can be woven together. And Krumah's plan was sound, but the people in power, the Western powers, had no intention of letting him succeed. And so while he was out of the country, the coup took place. Most embarrassing thing for all of us, because he is our great leader, the symbol of our struggle on both sides of the ocean. And then he had this international posture. And here he's lost his nation. Because all of us were in tears. We said, well, how could this happen? But it happened. The European has his plans and he can't be trusted. And he's had more coups in Africa than any other place in the world. And so, unfortunately, Nkrumah was in East Africa. He went to go to join Tito in Yugoslavia or go to Romania. I had a girlfriend or so in Romania, or secretary, and she's written several books. So she's very good and protected his legacy. And so here, our great leader with a vision for Africa and the Pan-African world and the global African community was an embarrassment. However, because in 1958, Ghana became independent, 57, and 58, Guinea said no to the French. We don't want your independence. We want real independence. So de Gaulle said, you do? Okay, we're going to give it to you. And we're going to take everything out of Guinea, the report cards, the toilet paper, the telephone, so that you'll know what it is to have the so-called independence. But Sékou Touré stood his ground, and he was able to stay above ground and not sink, because Nkrumah took 10,000 pounds, that's like $50 million. He and big money at that time, and he gave it to save Guinea. Guinea's revolutionary posture was saved by cocoa and coffee money, money from Ghana, because you had the Korean War and other wars, and America needed these cocoa, chocolate, as part of the kit that the soldiers had. And so it pushed the price of cocoa up. And so he was able to save the Guinea Revolution. The beautiful thing is that when he was overthrown and in the situation where he was, Sékou Touré had said, come home to Guinea and be the president of Guinea. And so Nkrumah didn't speak French, and so it was a little awkward, but Sékou did it, and it was an honest gesture. But they worked it out where they had a co-presidency. And so he was able to keep his people calm, and Kruma was able to keep the people that were following him, knowing that they were still in the struggle. And he was able to spend the last 7 or 8 years of his life writing all these books about the revolution in Rhodesia, the revolution in this and that. And so it's a fantastic story. It's not a sad story at all.
Nkrumah was probably Africa's greatest visionary. As he said, the independence of Ghana meant nothing unless it was linked to the unification of Africa. He placed Pan-Africanism on the top of the agenda. He brought in Africans from around the world, particularly the Caribbean and the US, to work in his administration, with P.A.P.O being the most influential advisor among the people who are outside the country. And with Padmore's advice, set up the organization of African Unity, which Malcolm patterned his organization of Afro-American Unity after. So he had some vision. He made mistakes. And I'll summarize a few of them. But what I want to do is just do a brief overview on Julius Nyerere. The reason we're taking these two giants is they were the giants of vision, and they offered Africa something. And if you look at Ghana today, what Nkrumah built is basically Ghana. The school system, the health system, as Dr. J talked about, the hydroelectric project and all of that. But Nyerere was the other side. Now, I worked in Tanzania, as I pointed out before, through the Pan African Peoples Organization in '73 in the Ujamaa villages for 3 months. I lost 15 pounds in working in those villages. And from one end of Tanzania to the other, met Nyerere in '77. And I have some papers here. Some of these I've shown before. This is us in Tanzania.
Oh, okay. Yes.
This is on one side, a guy with the big natural, that's me. We're meeting with SWAPO, Southwest African Peoples Organization, and with other liberation movements, and with the party in Tanzania, then TANU, Tanzania, Tanganyika African Union. And then in the villages, we brought a team of 11 people. They paid their own way. And so this is a picture of our people working. The sisters worked the dukas, which were the stores, but they also worked in the fields. We basically did agricultural work, and it's hard work. In fact, we were working so hard that people told us we're working too hard, slow down, because you're in the heat and, you know, people have to take a rest. But we had come in here with this gung-ho attitude, which we wouldn't have had we lived in Tanzania. This is the President Julius Nyerere, and you see him. This newspaper is a paper we put out called The African Awakening. We had our own printing press, Pan African Peoples Organization. This is Nyerere, who is meeting with villagers, working with them on their projects and through agricultural production.
Yes.
And this newspaper article here records a meeting that I had with Nyerere in 1977. And I pointed this out before, report on Secretariat Information Contact Center. We met with Nyerere for 2 hours outside his home, brought him a film of African Liberation Day, which that year C.O.R.E. James spoke. And I have a picture of him speaking at African Liberation Day, 29,000 people. So we brought him a film of that and we met. And we were then proposing to set up an information center in Tanzania. So I'm speaking from a background of having worked there, and then our people have been active in Tanzania. Now we have a guest center in Zanzibar, in Tanzania. So the reason I'm focusing on Nyerere is I think that while Nkrumah had the big ideas for Pan-Africanism and did a lot for the development of Ghana, Nyerere, I think, had the best approach for economic development for Africa, where Africa is now. And an incremental approach where if you start at this level, then you can move to do the other things like industrialization, which Kwame Nkrumah was dealing with. When we went to Tanzania in 1973, we didn't know that there had been a Ujamaa village project that had occurred in the 60s. We thought that the project we were involved in, which was launched in the late 60s and in the 70s, was the first Ujamaa village project. But we come to find out later that there had been a movement before, and this is the one that I want to focus on and point out why this is valuable for Africa today, and its model is valuable for us as well in terms of cooperative economics. Ujamaa means in Swahili familyhood, or sharing through the family. It's the equivalent of communalism. So there was a project in the 60s started by a group called the RDA. And the RDA was the Ruvuma Development Association. Ruvuma Development Association. Nyerere had called at independence for Ujamaa villages. Grassroots Tanzanians took this call up. And this is really why this phase of Ujamaa was successful, because it was taken up voluntarily by the people and had some good leadership among the people. These were people, many of whom couldn't read and write, some who could, but they were agriculturalists. And basically that's what you need to build up an economy starting from scratch, which is agricultural. So they built up 17 Ujamaa villages from scratch with no government support, no money, no nothing. Nyerere would support them later, but it was on their own initiative. And one of the reasons why this project succeeded was because it was based on fundamental principles of African culture. What's that? Cooperative sharing and collective decision-making. It was not a single person making decisions. And these were people who voluntarily took this project on at great risk, because this was a new idea, even though the villages had been organized this way before. So the people who founded the RDA had virtually no financial resources. But what they had was a willingness to work together. And they had a belief that if they worked together, they could pool the economic power of the people, in this case through agricultural development, and really build up something that would be lasting for Tanzania, because they saw this spreading and becoming a part of the whole way in which Tanzania built up its own system. So this is the RDA. Now, Nyerere in 1954 organizes TANU, Tanganyika African National Union. That was the political party of Tanzania. And that would become the Independence Party, Tanzanian African National Union. Now it's CCM. And it would lead the independence movement in Tanzania. Now, to understand Nyerere's orientation is to understand this. He lived in the village for 12 years. And the village he lived in was called Butiama, B-U-T-I-A-M-A. His father was a chief. But the key point is Nyerere was inculcated with village life. So he had an orientation around traditional African life that shaped him, because these 12 years, these are your formative years. And so Nyerere thought like a villager. And of course, he spoke Swahili, which was the national, became the national language of Tanzania, even though there are a lot of other languages. So he was oriented to this worldview of a villager. And he was oriented to this idea that African traditions of sharing, what he ended up calling Ujamaa, would work in building up a country. Now, Nyerere, like Nkrumah, leaves Tanzania to get a university education. He's the first one in Tanzania to get it. He's probably privileged because his father was a chief, but also he was smart. He was able to, matriculate in this white boy's education. So he went to Edinburgh, and through 49 and 52, he got a master's, and then he went back to Tanzania and he taught, just as Nkrumah did, and he was called walimu, teacher, that comes from his educational background. But here's the key thing about him, another key thing about him. And Dr. J started this off when he was talking about John Henry Clark and his respect for African women. Nyerere had a deep respect for African women. And this is real key, because he observed his father had over 20 wives, but he observed how the African women in the villages did most of the work and the men didn't do enough. And so he was very critical of that. And he saw the value of the African woman and the need of the African woman to be involved in the organization of an independent Tanzania, and for that work to be shared. And so that the men took on their burden of work. So he was a critic of the laziness of some African men and of the strength of African women and their willingness to work hard to build up a country. Nyerere didn't make the mistake of most independent leaders of Africa who wanted to industrialize first. He realized you had to build agriculture first, and then based on agriculture, you could industrialize. And then if you look how China's moved, that was really the move that Deng Xiaoping made when he finally lets the farmers loose to make their own decisions. That's when China really kicks off, and then they can do other things. But it was really relying on the people who produced the food. Mao hadn't been so good at that. Deng Xiaoping was. But in the case of Nyerere, Nyerere understood that Africa suffered from exploitation of colonialism, and that the structures of colonialism were still there after independence. And I should add the mental structures as well. And this would be the problem that Nyerere would face with his own leadership. By the way, when I met Nyerere in 77, he made this comment. He knew he could have built Tanzania with the help of others, non-Africans, but he had to have Africans running things, but he had to prove that Africans could run their own country. His only problem is some of these Africans had very little respect because they had their little university education or whatever, and they had this idea that they were better than the people and didn't want to listen to them. And this was a problem that Nyerere had to deal with. Not all in his party, but too many. And so in the beginning of Africa's independence, in places like Congo Brazzaville, you had an African, which in Tanzania, they call them Wananchi, everyday people. This was a comment they made at independence. This is Congo Brazzaville, where Theophile Obenga lives. They said this, quote, "Independence isn't for us, it's for the city people." You understand? They could see that there was an elite emerging, and that unless independence focused on their needs, they wouldn't benefit from this. And this has been one of the problems for African independence. An elite has benefited while the masses too often haven't. So what happens with Nyerere in February 1961, he launches a criticism against the elite in his own party, TANU, Tanganyika, now Tanzanian African National Union. He said, I'm quoting him, "Party leaders, quote, are getting drunk with power and scheming to undermine each other." And that's part of the colonial legacy. We often look at the brainwashing of not liking yourself and hating or imitating the European. What we often don't look at is, because we haven't really studied this Europeans' culture that well, we don't look at the fact that the essence of their culture is the people in charge lord over everybody else, their own people and those that they colonize or whoever they subject to their power. They call themselves lords and masters. That meaning Aryan. That's their view. And too many Blacks picked up that view because they had observed it under colonialism. And so Nyerere was not one of them. So Nyerere's comment was 200 million, because at that time the population of Africa was 200 million. 200 million Africans are looking at us, and they will blame us if we end up pocketing the resources and the people do not end up benefiting. So like in Kruma, Nyerere cared about the people. That was his first and foremost interest. And by the way, when he becomes president, shortly after he becomes president, he steps down from office. Why? He wants to go into the villages to politicize people around Ujamaa, the need for, Africans to organize around agriculture, and then around that to build up an industrial base as well. So one of the things he makes clear to the people is this: Ujamaa was going to depend upon self-reliance. This, by the way, was a Garvey principle, one that I learned from Garvey as well, that you got to go on your own steam. And so he was telling the people that this is not going to occur overnight. This change is not going to occur overnight. And to build up these villages, what we will have to do is draw on the few resources we have. That will be the basis for building a strong Tanzania. And so what happens in the RDA, these villages that the people pick up, they start with one and then it spreads and people come into the villages and observe. And they were smart because for these villages to work, they couldn't be too large. And so the RDA would not allow a village to go beyond 400 because if it went beyond 400, the people wouldn't really have a say-so in it, be a lot of confusion. So people who are coming from the outside, they would come to one of the RDA villages and then they would learn how to do this and then go back and set up a village of their own. They ended up with the RDA villages having a central school where students went to from a number of villages. When I was in Tanzania and we worked the villages, you go to a school of 100 students. It's like the old Southern Black school. You had every age group, one teacher, and you could drop a pin and it would sound like a bomb because these kids were there to learn. And in these, the villages, when we went back in 73, they were setting up healthcare and stuff like that. So the idea of the Ujamaa village was that people in the rural areas could have the life that people in the cities could get, often didn't, but many could. And so that was the vision of Ujamaa. And it was a sharing vision. And the key thing is people were meeting collectively, regularly, and making decisions. So what happens to Ujamaa? This is the key thing. It's unfortunate, but this is the key thing. Nyerere supported these villages. Nyerere was in and out of them. There were times where TANU party leaders wouldn't want him to go to a village, but he'd insist on going. But what ends up happening is the TANU leaders are opposed to these villages. Why? Because they think that the masses of Tanzanians don't have enough sense to make their own decisions. And as a result, and this, by the way, when Chancellor Williams does his book, Rebirth of African Civilization, and I pointed this out when I was dealing with the interview with Dr. Obenga, he went in and studied 3,000, interviewed 3,000 Ghanaians with the help of a lot of Ghanaians who helped him. And when he asked the people, what did they want at independence, and Nerari and Kruma had supported this study, but he didn't follow it. And he was asked, what did the people want at independence? They said they didn't want Marxism, they didn't want capitalism, they wanted cooperative democracy. That's the very thing that Tanzania was practicing. And so what happens is there's a certain point where the Central Committee meeting is occurring in Tanzania. That's the people that lead the party, and they're opposing the RDA. Nyerere has to go out of the country for business. When he comes back, they have disbanded the RDA. Can you imagine? All these villages that are successful are disbanded because these arrogant Africans figured that grassroots people didn't know what they were doing. Well, guess what? Grassroots people, 140,000 years we've been on the planet, African people. We are the best agriculturalists on the planet, and we certainly are the best for Africa. And so who's best to build a village that's agricultural? Farmers. I mean, they don't know what they're doing. You know what I mean? So Nyerere was disappointed, but Nyerere believed in the party. And Nyerere believed that these few skilled Africans, skilled at what is a question, who had university educations, they were necessary for running Ghana. So he didn't like it, but he didn't overturn the decision. And when we went back in 73, this was the second Ujamaa project. This wasn't all voluntary, and that was something that wasn't good. Some villages were voluntary, some were not. But we saw how some of these villages were really taken off. We were in villages where, because they had a rule of setting aside a certain amount of money to use for development. And so there was a certain point. I went back in 1984, And this was a very important time. And I get a report from one of the highest ranking African Americans in the Tanzanian government. And he tells me that people have come in to the party now, and they have been successful in some of their villages. They want to now move to industrialization. And what happens? The party tells them they're capitalists. They're violating the basic principles of Tanzania. And as a result, they disband these villages for the second time and sabotage it and end it. Now, that's not the only reason that these villages had trouble, but that was the main reason. So I want to conclude on this one with Tanzania and also say that Nkrumah had some of these problems inside his own party, and Africa did as well, good leaders. This was a problem that Amilcar Cabral feared he'd have, because one of Nkrumah's favorite visitors in exile was Amilcar Cabral. And Cabral was worried about what he saw happen in Ghana and in other places. He was worried that if they became free, that an elite might take over. So he had a de-brainwashing process for his elite, but he wasn't able to completely carry it out. And so this is the final point I want to make, is that a Nyerere and Nkrumah and the leadership that has been positive for Africa, and this is true for African people as well, have been those who place the people first. They have been those who were able to listen to the people. Now, Nyerere didn't always listen either, because I remember at Six-Pack, he said, "I am the government of Tanzania." But then he was relying on the people under him who didn't have the same interest that he had, which was the people's interest. And that, why, by the way, was one of Nkrumah's problems, is that by the time Nkrumah was overthrown, it had become a one-person state. One reason is he was being shot at. There were efforts to overthrow him, and so he was trying to maintain his power. But the key point is, if Africa is going to move forward, then this move to build up the economy, starting with agriculture, is key. This move to allow the people to make their own decisions is key, because that's how African economies have worked and African societies have worked in the past. And from that, you can begin to accumulate the capital to build up an industrial base. And of course, we need larger units. This is the goal of Pan Africanism. But the final thing is, we need a de-brainwashing process. A process that frees our mind from mental slavery, which is what we faced here, and mental colonialism, which Africa and Caribbean and that part of the African world that has faced that face. And that is a process for freeing the mind. And that process was something that a Cabral went through. That was a process that Malcolm went through. That was a process Nyerere didn't have to go through, because he had been inculcated in village culture, and it remained with him. And by the way, one of the things that impressed me most about Nyerere was a little guy, and you could see he was tough, but he was humble and he was self-critical. He didn't just come in talking about how great everything is. He was always talking about the problems that they had. And he warned us, because we were trying to set up an information center. He warned us. He said, there are a lot of Africans that don't want you here. He's not talking about the grassroots. He's talking about this elite that sabotaged a project that could not only have saved Tanzania, but saved Africa. So this free the mind process has got to be a key part of anything they do. So that's my little contribution. And I would just say, Nyerere and Nkrumah each had visions that were important. And by the way, Nyerere, shortly before his death, went back to Ghana and said, Nkrumah was right, because he was talking about regional Pan-Africanism, forming regional units and then building continental unity. By the end, he said, well, Nkrumah was right to go for the whole thing. But the key point is, they were both visionaries that made a great contribution to Africa. They had their weaknesses. I'd say one of Nkrumah's biggest weaknesses was that maybe too westernized. and maybe not drawing enough on traditional African culture, particularly around governance. And that's where Dankwa brought in some things. I know that there were problems on both sides with Dankwa and Nkrumah. And this is one of John Henry Clark's critiques as well, that Africa needs to draw more from the systems that have worked prior to colonialism while updating them. And the biggest one is let the people make decisions. That's the big one. And that's one your Western education teaches you not to do. And that we're only going forward with people power. Leonard, you got anything to add to that? And we'll wrap up.
Well, you've done a fantastic job in trying to let folks know some of the dynamics that are necessary when you're in these struggles. And even though you may have an ideological stance, the reality is something else. Rosalind went upstairs so she could contribute to your great work. And she brought down Ujamaa, Lessons on Socialism by Julius Nerari.
Yeah.
But she added to that a fantastic copy of New Africa with Nkrumah's legacy.
Nice.
And an extraordinary picture. And Kruma, we must unite now or perish. An abridged version of Nkrumah's historic speech delivered May 24th, 1963 at the founding of the conference of OAU in Addis Ababa. And there's Nkrumah making his strong speech. But there are the Algerians, there's Gamal Nasser, etc. So we've been trying to pull together this sweep of history, and our people need to understand that it is real. There's a picture here that I've never seen, but I've seen a picture before, but Nkrumah and his mother. And so that Nkrumah and the forgotten Anglo-Portuguese alliance, and there he is with his mother, who was the main person keeping him on the straight and narrow as he went through life. And so you've done a fantastic job. Dr. Clark would say he'd have to pat you on and give you a medal because he left us with his last great work.
Yeah, that's his great work.
Notes for an African World Revolution, Africans at the Crossroads.
Yeah.
Lumumba, Garvey, and Malcolm and Nkrumah. And so we have to give thanks that we've been able to stay the course. I know a lot of our people are saying, how much more do they expect me to take in one swallow? But we're trying to overload so that you'll know how significant all of this work is.
Guess what? I've cut the time. Normally it's gone longer than this. And behind Leonard is this great lady, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries.
Okay, I just wanted briefly that was a wonderful expose that you gave. I was sitting here like in tears because when you started talking about the land and people working the land, I was thinking about my own brother in South Carolina and the land that our ancestors worked so hard to build and to work, and many of the others that were farmers, and what has happened to the massive farms in America owned by Blacks that they no longer own. And I'm thinking too about the Nawabians who were trying to build their village. I'm thinking about the South Carolinian people or surgerymen who tried to build their villages. I'm thinking of all of the Ghanaians that were in Tennessee that were trying. I'm thinking about the Nation of Islam that owned land in the West because they wanted to raise cattle and for the meat to filtrate into all of the Shabazz restaurants across the country. What you have said today, it needs to be heard over and over. The importance of raising the land at the ground roots level, and then moving into industries, but to not give up. And yet we find the Chinese so eager in sustainable development coming in to try to do what was already done by our people. Are we cycling over and over in a losing battle, or cycling over and over the generations for a new civilization. The young people that don't even know how to sew a hymn and a comment to want to buy another one. And so that what you're saying is so pertinent and fundamental at this deep level. And it's wonderful when you can get two giants in the same field talking like this. I don't know what's going on in the Black studies arena in other cases, but we do know that the old timers of the Black study movements have a lot of answers. Thank God they're still alive.
And
And
thank God.
Rosalind, stay there, stay there. You're a master yourself and your whole area, because I'm often very critical of us, is we don't pay enough attention to our own culture. And the way you do art, both for Africa, African art, and African American, I think that's invaluable. And your contribution politically and otherwise, historically and otherwise, and the two of you, in the way you have shown your love for Africa and it's been given back, and your relationship to traditional healers. Both of you are a wonderful team, and you, Rosalind, you are a precious jewel, a precious
I
jewel.
say that I am 85 and I am still, believe it or not, teaching. And I teach on the Zoom. And so into this very living room is P.A.P.O students who are in China, communist China, in my class. Many from Korea, many from China, and some from Brazil, Ecuador. I had Russian in my class. So people who are European, but some of them end up coming to New York and then they get zoomed in. When my class turned so extremely international, I said, well, where's the Black students? Because at one time I had a lot of Black students in the class during the era of affirmative action. But affirmative action has grown that the attention is on China now because of the politics, how we owe China so much money, and we know China in Africa and the whole deal. But Leonard Brothers told me, said, go ahead, stay there and teach. Teach them African-American history. Teach them race and ethnic relation. And I'm still teaching also African art. And I always talk about you, because that book you did that was called The Generation Gap, in there, you were describing the supreme god of the Twa, the Anu, which is on the cover of the book, and in describing them, that is another side of Pan-Africanism. That's the side, because those were the people who call their god Ilana, which means pulling energy, which we know that it was the science. So when we say we are conscious of things, what are we saying? Con means with, and science means science. With science, which the science of the mind, the science of the soil, the science of nature, the science of everything, the science and the arts are worked together in Ujamaa, in the collective under Ilana. And you go from country to country, we can trace in art the elements of the Sanctua amongst the people of the Bakuba. When you see that forehead very large, that's a symbol and sign of those people. When you go to Kemet, you'll see some of the ancestral line to do it best, etc. And so all of the different countries in Benin, those short people were in reference to the Twa. So that there is a cultural side. We know the political side is supreme in a sense because of what you just said in your lecture.
Well, we need that was a surprise, and that was
that's beautiful.
And the beautiful thing is that Rosalind has deep South Carolinian roots, and they preserved 150 acres, and her brother was hoping to do something with it, but he just didn't have, that's her baby brother that she helped to raise. Yeah. And he just didn't have the support, but he preserved it
Yeah.
But the family wasn't working together. Now, Robinson is her family name. My mother's side has Robinson also, but there is a Jackie Robinson who everybody knows, the greatest, most exciting baseball player. And Jackie Robinson's son, David, has a connection to Tanzania. In fact, he was so successful. He's been in touch with me and helped to write up the story of what he did. He went and helped. He married a Tanzanian woman, and he helped to organize dozens of villages, and he created a co-op, and they were able to have it marketed on the international market. And the person who handled that was my lawyer, who gave me the victories in the court, Joseph Fleming, who lived right here in Teaneck. So and David had said that he has found a history of the family, and he wanted me to help to guide him to write that history. So to have the personal contact with Tanzania and with Ghana and with the other parts of our struggle, it's wonderful. So we have to, pat you on the backside.
Pat you all on the backside too, because you started this off by talking about John Henry Clark and his relationship to the three women who were the pillars in his life. And then Rosalind comes in and is talking about the land issue, and then spirit as it runs through our culture. And the tie-in again is this: for Africa, if you don't free up the African woman, because the African woman is the one that feeds the continent, and it's the African woman, if you empower her, the man's automatically empowered. You empower the man, you empower nobody. You know what I mean? But the woman carries the culture, and the women are the ones who have innovated agriculture to begin with. And then when you combine that with spirit power, which is God, connecting yourself to the ultimate truth, then you are unbeatable. And so instead of us looking for answers outside of us, we got the answers right in here. And the two of you are models. And I love you, Leonard. And Rosalind, you're special to me because you are one precious, lovely, brilliant, take no prisoners, African and African American. You know what I mean? You bridge the waters, and you come from South Carolina. South Carolina is the depths of the African roots of Africans in America, South Carolina. James Smalls, your protege, is an expression of that. That's one reason why I like him. Integrity, and he got that spirit stuff. If James say, my spirit don't like you, you're in trouble. And he's usually right. You know what I mean?
And they just had on the TV a fantastic program on the relationship between Africans from Sierra Leone and South Carolina, and the basket weaving, and it was just unbelievable. I couldn't believe it.
Wow.
And so this again is a part of the history that we've got to. Sierra Leone has a special role to play in the role that it's created, and so hey, we got to
wrap this up. But this has been wonderful again. And Rosalind, since you told me that you do a thing on the internet, I would like to have the opportunity to have some conversations with you on this show. You know what I mean? And if you can't do it, then we need to have some private conversation. But I'd like to have you, because you need to share this also with us as well. And the work you're doing with the world, keep doing it. That's important. That's real important. Keep it up. And by the way, I'm 82. I'm years behind the two of you. And I'm going to keep that distance.
and the beautiful thing is the family relationship, the husband-wife relationship, the brother relationship. Asa had it, and he contributed.
Right.
His cousin Jake had it, and he contributed.
Right.
And it has gone on and on and on. So
I wouldn't be what I am without them.
Yes.
I wouldn't have been tenured without Asa. Jake was like one of my masters. When I wanted to read something, Asa too. I say, hey, Jake, what should I read? And he said, I don't know. And then he'd come up with something. And without Asa, FBI would have had my job. Asa is the one that was up there fighting for me. And one day he brings me into his office and he says, you don't have to fight anymore. You won. How do you know that? He was out there fighting for me. You know what I mean? But that was Asa. Asa was, as the former owner of Marcus Bookstore, Julian Richardson said, I never heard a person say a negative thing about Asa Hilliard.
That's true.
Now that's the loving nature of Asa. You know what I mean?
And his wife, Patsy Joe, and
right.
his children,
Right.
and his mother, who was an evangelist, who stopped the churches when she went in there. They said, Miss Minnie has arrived. And so he really, he had it in his genes and he gave it back.
Yeah.
He shared it.
Exactly. Exactly. So this has been wonderful. I've enjoyed every minute of it. And I know people are going to love this because I'm going to say this again. You better understand, this is some history you heard here. You ain't never going to find in a book. These are books right here. Dr. Rosalind Jeffries just came in and shared a little bit of her insight with us. Boy, I mean, if she just sheds a little bit more, enlightened, it'll light you up and you'll explode. And what I like most about the two of you is your goodness. You're good people. Because when I first met you, Leonard, I didn't know who you were. I called Wade up. I said, hey, Wade, who's Leonard Jeffries? He said, oh, man, he's a dedicated brother, blah, blah, blah. And then I got to meet you and Rosalind, and I said, uh-huh. Uh-huh.
A new wife who filled in the gap, who has the background from the Caribbean and is in the Pan African struggle as well. So to pick up someone is a blessing who can continue on in the way that you started.
Yeah, that's Pamela Hurley Tashaka. She's out there in New York right now. They just had a funeral for her mother yesterday. She's a little tiny piece of dynamite, and I love her. You know what I mean? I like food with seasoning, and I got some real seasoning with her. And she's real wise, real conscious. She's raised a wonderful son, Kojo, who's graduated from construction management. His father was the first person in Barbados to get a degree in architecture from Oxford. You understand? And Pam is just a walking book. She's also good in nutrition. She trained herself in nutrition. So yeah, that's key. If black man ain't got him a good black woman, too bad for him.
Still love Anasa, but we also are looking forward to meet the new diamond.
Yeah, Anasa passed away about 5 years ago, and we sent her off in a real nice way. And I wouldn't be what I am now but for her. I learned a whole lot in our relationship, you know.
And we have to give a special shout out to our sister who's about to make her transition. Her brother called me. As soon as Charles got here to set this up, I got a call from her, Leah, Sister Leah, who is with Professor Small, myself, over the last 20, 30 years, and trying to make our work in Ghana successful. And she's hung on, but her brother said that she is about to make the transition. So we want to dedicate what we've been doing here to people like Leah. Because
Leah Williams.
Leah Williams. And she is like people like Wade is a very powerful brother, but when you have a sister who's lost her mobility to move, Wade's wife, and she goes to the conferences and she makes her presentation. Her and Rosalind got together at this last big conference we had, the international conference, and she opened it up. And she was so fantastic and lifted it so high.
Vera Nobles.
Vera Nobles.
Yeah.
Rosalind came after her, and she raised it high. And then the Senegalese doctor, female doctor, she just blew the roof off the building. So those are the things that we have to, Dr. Clark is very proud, looking down, well, we taught you all well, so you're supposed to do what you do. And we just celebrate as a family.
Right on.
And then
that's a brother that I really love. You know?
And then
Renoko Rashidi, right on.
Runoko Rashidi.
Yes.
And because he was close to all of us, you know, in the work that he did,
Yeah.
and the funeral and the people happy film developers are the ones that are planning with Tony Browder a trip to Egypt in February. So those who are interested in going to Egypt with Wade Noble and James Smalls and yourself, if you would like to be a part of the group, Dr. Shalans, a number of other people are going in February, the end of February, but the information they can get from queuing in on the YouTube H-A-P-I, Happy, the Happy is the name for the Nile River,
Right.
and find the information.
Yeah, thanks for that, because Runoko did unique work in his global, orientation around Africa, particularly Africans in Asia, and but also Kemet and everything else. And he said he wanted to go 100 areas in the world, and he did more than that.
That's right. He really would. And he didn't have the support system that most of us have.
Right.
But he was able to make it work no matter what. Now, we talked about Sheikh Anta, we talked about Mbaki, and this is the book that his son wrote on his life. This is, it's in French, but you need to get it for your library. It's produced by Presence African, and it has some fantastic pictures. I'm looking here at the whole picture of the Africans that he was in touch with, Sheikh Anta, etc. And so to have your son follow your work, and he's a scientist too, it's really.
Yeah, it shows that you left a good legacy. Okay, yes. Thanks, Dr. J.
All right. Hey,
thanks, Rosalind. Beautiful.
Hey. Forever, Black Power. And my nephew Hassan, Dr. Hassan, has written a book, The Struggle for the Vote in Lowndes County. And when you were mentioning Stokely and Bloody Lowndes, and Dr. Hassan Jeffries doing well. Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Hey,
Rosalind. Enjoyed every minute of it.
And we have to thank Charles. He fell asleep, but he got here in time to set things up.
Yeah, thank him. And there'll be more of this. Talk to you later.